Can we make sense of them for today, or are they Bronze Age myths that we should be happy to consign to history, to the bin of history? Well, those three guests joining me today are Professor Richard Dawkins, well-known biologist and, of course, a leading voice in atheism. His best-selling book, The God Delusion, included a chapter on whether we can draw morality from the Bible, so we'll be asking him about that. His latest book is his autobiography, An Appetite for Wonder. C.Sinkinson is a Christian pastor and lecturer in the Old Testament at Moreland College. His new book, Time Travel to the Old Testament, aims to show how the books of the Old Testament are realistic and relevant for today. Rabbi Josh Levy is from the Northwestern Reformed Synagogue in London, also known as the Atheist Synagogue. He's part of Reformed Judaism as a movement and is an occasional speaker and commentator on radio and TV. And worth saying, for the record, as if you're listening to this on a Saturday afternoon, we are pre-recording today's programme, and so there are no Sabbath rules being broken in order for Josh to join us on the programme today. A very warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, let's start with you, someone I've long wanted to have on this programme. So thank you for making the time to join us today. First of all, would you want to just give us a little bit of background? And if people want the full story, of course, they can buy your latest book. But you kind of embraced atheism really in your late teens, was it?
Yes, I suppose you could say that. But that's not got a lot to do with what we're talking about, which is the Old Testament.
Indeed.
Which you can appreciate as a work of literature, and I do.
Yes, I mean, you've been familiar in that sense with the Bible from a young age, haven't you?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And what sort of an impact would you say the Bible had on you as a youngster, and how did your views develop on it over time?
I learned the stories of the Old Testament. I learned the stories of Genesis about Abraham and the stories of King David and so on. As a child at school, I seem to have had a near photographic memory in those days and almost seem to know them by heart. I suppose the sort of Christian attitude in which I was brought up was that the Old Testament God wasn't as nice as the New Testament God, and so we were kind of slightly warned off the Old Testament in a way. But I love the books as literature in the King James translation. I, of course, can't read the Hebrew, and I have no time for modern translations, which seem to me to lose the poetry.
So you can appreciate, as it were, especially in the King James translation, that there is a beauty of sorts to aspects of the Bible.
There's certainly beauty in the English. I'm aware that the books that made it into the canon are pretty arbitrary collection, and not to be treated with actually much more reverence than any of the or many of the other books that didn't make it into the canon.
Well, it's something we could certainly open up in the course of the discussion today. Now, I understand you haven't had a chance to watch it, but throughout December, Channel 5 is airing a mini-series, in fact 10 hours altogether, of Bible stories. What do you think about that? Do you welcome people becoming familiar again with those Old Testament stories and so on?
Yes, I haven't seen the programme, as you say. I will make a point of watching it in future. I do welcome it in the sense that it's a part of our literary heritage in this country, indeed in our English language, and you can't appreciate English literature without being familiar with some of the phrases, indeed many of the phrases. I think in The God Delusion I had a couple of pages solidly packed with phrases from the Bible which are familiar, proverbial, and you can't really take your allusions without them. Many people are probably not aware of the fact that they do come from the Bible, many of them from the Old Testament.
So you encourage people to be familiar with the Bible, even though you obviously don't necessarily agree with all of the contents therein?
Yes, I do. I encourage people to be familiar with the Bible for literary and historic reasons. You also, of course, can't understand history unless you are familiar with the religious tradition of our country and other European countries.
OK, well, thank you for joining us on the programme today. And we're going to be getting into some of the issues that you outlined, several years ago now in The God Delusion, when you spoke about some of the moral issues, especially in the Old Testament in Scripture. Two other guests joining me in studio today to discuss this whole area. Rabbi Josh Levy is from the Northwestern Reformed Synagogue. Josh, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
It's great to have you on. A little bit of background to yourself. You grew up within Judaism.
Absolutely. I've grown up in progressive Judaism my whole life. and have been working at Alyth, which is one of the largest synagogues in the country, for the last 5 years. And Progressive Judaism is a liberal religious movement, so we are engaged with Scripture and with text very deeply, but also believe in progressive revelation. And obviously we're going to talk a little about how you reconcile those two things as we go forward.
And the branch, if you like, of Judaism that you come from is as opposed to Orthodox Judaism. If you want to just briefly explain the difference.
Sure. So the fundamental difference between Orthodoxy and Progressive Judaism is in their understanding of the origin of Torah, the origin of the Old Testament, and particularly the 5 books of Moses. So Judaism classically has had a principle called Torah min hashamayim, that the Torah is from heaven. And that principle came to form much of what's modern-day Judaism. Clearly, with Enlightenment, we came to understand that the Torah needs to be read, the Old Testament needs to be read in a different way. And Progressive Judaism has responded to those discoveries about text and has kind of begun to think differently theologically and in practice about what it is to be Jewish in the modern world.
C.Sinkinson, finally, thank you for joining us again in studio today. You're over at Moorland College down near Bournemouth. Tell us a little bit about what you do there.
Well, in terms of relevance to this show, I teach Old Testament, and I encourage students to wrestle with the text, including the problem passages, and to try and preach and teach and use it in ministry. So I'm a fan of the Old Testament. And actually, I found that very helpful, what Richard was sharing in terms of the value of the Old Testament as literature. I think that is a very useful kind of starting point. And clearly, as a Christian, I would add to that I come to the Old Testament through Jesus Christ, so it's my understanding of Jesus that informs how I read the text. And I appreciate what Josh said about progressive revelation, because I think that's a helpful term to use, that when we read the Old Testament, we recognise an unfolding revelation. We can't simply take something out of context as if it were a timeless moment. We have to see it as part of a progressive revelation of God's character. And as a Christian, it's through Christ that I interpret the Old Testament. So that's how I understand this progressive revelation, heading towards him, which is, of course, important, I think, for me, because it may be during our discussion together we'll focus on what are sometimes called the terror texts in the Old Testament. And the Bible TV series, I think, began with a disclaimer when the first episode aired, saying that this programme contains violence, viewers' discretion advised, which, of course, our Bibles could have on the front. I think Richard might encourage that to be an advisory comment at the front of our Bibles.
I watched on demand. I had to tick a box that said I was over 16 to be allowed to be in relationship with the Old Testament.
So, just to say on these terror texts that these are not my favourite passages in the Bible. You know, these are not the immediate passages I turn to for my devotional readings. That doesn't mean to say I want to cut them out and bin them, but it does mean that I place them in a context of a progressive unfolding revelation. And the atheists are not the first people to struggle with these passages. Yeah. Christians have struggled with them down through the years too.
Coming back to you then, Richard, how do you take the Old Testament? Do you believe that it is essentially mainly fictional sort of literature?
I'd be surprised if very much of it was factual. The early parts of it, the Pentateuch is clearly the Jewish foundational myth. It includes the creation myths and the sort of myths of the origin of the Jewish people. I understand from archaeological friends there's almost no factual content in it. There certainly isn't any factual content in the scientific parts, in the bits about creation of the world and the universe and so on. And I suspect there's rather little factual content in the stories of Abraham, of the exile in Egypt, of the escape from Egypt, the Egyptian plagues and so on. So it is a collection of myths. They happen to be Jewish myths. Some of them are inherited from earlier peoples like the Sumerians. As myths, they are fascinating. I mean, myths all around the world are fascinating. All three of us happen to have been born into cultures which were immersed in this particular Jewish myth, as opposed to the myths of the North American Indians, or of the Chinese, or of the Indians, or South Sea Islanders, or any of the other myths, or Africans, any of the other myths that we could have been brought up in. So there is really no reason at all to be talking about the Jewish myths any more than any of the other myths around the world. All of them are anthropologically interesting, but that's it.
You're looking a bit pensive there, Josh, in response.
Well, I mean, I can understand why Richard would say that. As a Jew, obviously, I come to those texts in a very particularistic way, which is they're my foundational myths. That is, I am necessarily in relationship with them if I am going to live as part of a Jewish religious and cultural life. So they are the foundational texts of my people. They're the formative stuff of the religious and cultural life that I lead. I mean, as it turns out, I doubt that Richard and I will disagree very much on issues of historicity. What we're going to differ on, I think, is probably whether or not that text continues to enrich people's lives. And as a Jew, it clearly continues to enrich my life. It is the foundational myth of the people of which I'm part.
Would it be
it's
fair?
the formative stuff that I do. It's my poetry, my story, the source of the legal code which then came to shape my religious and cultural practice. So as a Jew, I have a very particularistic relationship with it.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, presumably you would agree that if you happen to have been born in China or India or Fiji or somewhere, you would say, well, the Fijian myths are the myths of my people, the Indian myths are the Hindu myths are the myths of my people. I mean, you recognize the arbitrary accident of the fact that you happen to have been born into a Jewish household, and that's why these are the myths of your people.
Right. I mean, I think our own personal religious and cultural identities are, inevitably arbitrary to some extent, but it is mine, and that's for me to live as a Jewish life engaged with my cultural traditions involves being in relationship with that text.
I'd be interested, Chris, but a couple of things that Richard pointed out as he started there. He doesn't believe there's any historical basis really to most of the Old Testament. Is that something you disagree with yourself?
I would disagree with that. I think, though, just to clarify, there's a couple of words that we've been using so far that I do think need some unpacking. One is the word literal, and what do we mean by literal interpretation? And the other is the word myth, which is very easy to use, but I think there's a much more complicated debate around what we mean by myth. And in fact, to be honest with you, in terms of popular debate, I think the word myth has been so stripped of any clear meaning that it's almost a useless word, which would have been much to the annoyance of someone like Tolkien, who spends so much time discussing mythology and the meaning of myth. So just to take those two words very, very quickly. First of all, if I could go with the word literal first, then what do we mean by interpreting the book literally? Literal does not mean simply interpreting something for its face value meaning. The sun rises and the sun sets. This is language we clearly know it's a conventional way of speaking about the relationship of the sun to the earth as we view it from our viewing platform. Likewise, with the Old Testament, we could talk about how there is a perspective on history and the world, and that's reflected in the way the stories are told. So to interpret the Old Testament literally doesn't mean always taking it at its face value. It means taking it seriously for the kind of literature it is. And myth, I don't think, is a particularly helpful word here. I mean, theologians use the word saga sometimes to describe the Old Testament. And I think that might be more helpful, because when we think about the history of the Old Testament, I'm sure Richard would agree that there's a historical kernel to the Old Testament story. I'm sure he wouldn't doubt that there's a historical story unfolding, but it's to what extent is that wrapped up in figures of speech and forms of writing and perhaps later traditions that have been incorporated into the story. That's what we need to disentangle. But that there's a core of history, I'm absolutely...
And you feel that is confirmed by archaeology and so on when you look into some of these core aspects of the Old Testament's history?
I do. I've been involved in an archaeological dig in Israel and for a couple of seasons, and what I'm aware of, I don't know which friends Richard was talking to at Oxford, but there really is a wide open debate here. I mean, you'll have archaeology doesn't provide a discipline where things are coming up from the ground date stamped. I mean, until you get to coins anyway. They're not date stamped with a record of who said what to who. Archaeology provides evidence which can be ambiguous, it needs explaining, and so there's a very vigorous debate going on in archaeology right now, and there are those who hold to a minimalist position and would suggest that there's very little evidence at all for the events of the Old Testament, but there's a very significant number of archaeologists, a very significant number, who would argue for what's sometimes called a more maximalist approach to reading the evidence, people like William Dever or Kenneth Kitchen.
Sorry, I mean...
do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I do think we need to be very careful about two things. One is, perhaps the really fundamental question is whether historicity matters. Whether actually... No, this is not a history book. That's not its function. It's not a science book. It is a people's grappling with their identity, their story, their experience of the world around them, that then came to inform other people's doing of that same thing. So for me, I'm, as it happens, deeply unconcerned with historicity. That doesn't bother me at all. I do think we need to recognise also that the Old Testament is not a unity, that there are different books within it doing different things. Clearly, there are points in the sort of pseudo-historical books at which the Old Testament is describing events that we know took place, because we have evidence, we have quite a lot of it in the British Museum, which describes the event taking place. But the Bible isn't doing history, it's doing theology. So when the Babylonians rampage and destroy Jerusalem, we know that happened. We know that the Bible is describing it. But the Bible is doing theology. It's seeing that in terms of reward and punishment and behaviour. It's doing a different thing.
Do you, Richard, coming back to you, do you think that the Bible has, the Old Testament especially, any value in terms of a moral dimension that it may cast?
Oh, now you're changing the subject, and that's an interesting change.
Well, I just wanted to, we'll cover a variety of subjects, hopefully.
I agree with Josh that historicity doesn't really matter, but I think I put it in a slightly different way. It doesn't matter because you wouldn't be bothering to ask the question about the, say, creation myths or the tribal myths of the Incas or the Aztecs. They are interesting, they're fascinating myths, but you wouldn't be having a debate to say, is there any historicity in the stories of sun gods and things? The only reason we're bothering to ask the question about the historicity of the Jewish myths is that we happen to have been brought up in them. But they are not special. They are just tribal myths like any other.
Chris,
could I make a distinction there? Because, you gave a very helpful description right at the beginning of the power and influence of the Old Testament narratives on Western culture. And I'd go even further than that and say that even history writing itself can find its roots in the Old Testament, in the way the Old Testament was written. Not that it's history, except Josh's point that it's not history as in a modern history textbook, it's not science as a modern science textbook. But in terms of history, it formulates a way of describing events which have a certain linearity and a certain meaning, which is reflected in the historical traditions, which will, we also look to the Greeks and Herodotus, but in terms of the modern world, our development of history and our understanding of history reflects a view which we find in the Old Testament, which I don't think we find in the Chronicles of Babylon. I don't think we find them in the Inca myths, that's for sure.
So you would, in a sense, then say these... It's not just sort of equal weighting between different myths around the world. There's something quite unique about the Old Testament. Okay, Richard?
I just don't see that. I notice you're quite happy about using the word myth for the Inca myths and the Aztec myths.
Yes, I'm not saying that the word myth. I'm using it because you used it to describe their stories and legends, and I do accept there is a category called myth. I just want to define it very carefully. I think myth does not have that rooting in linear historical progression, and that's where I think our modern understanding of history has a much more of a reliance on the Jewish tradition than would have come out of the Inca mythological cycles. Stories which aren't rooted in time and place. We find that in the great Hindu epics as well, which, again, are not rooted in time and place, not concerned with the genealogies and the locations and who was king when, in the way that the Old Testament narrators were.
Yes, Richard, and then we'll bring in George.
Well, that may be so. I don't think it's a very, I don't think it's a very deeply important point. If it's so, I suspect the same is probably true of some other mythologies. I don't want to make a big thing of it.
But it's deeply important in terms of our respect for the historical processes and the development of history as a Western discipline. And that's why this is important. It's foundational for more than just the Jewish people. It's foundational in other respects.
There's so much of the Old Testament which is taken to be historical. Both of you gentlemen are sophisticated who don't do this. But the fact is that more than 40% of the American population think that the book of Genesis, including the six-day story of creation, is literally true. And this is a problem which I have as a scientist, and I hope and believe that both of you stand up and vigorously oppose such literalistic fundamentalism.
Right, but I think that is because we recognise, certainly I recognise, that that's not the function of this text. I want to step back a little bit, because I think Richard is actually asking probably one of the fundamental questions about religion, which is, why should we privilege this particular text over any other text?
Exactly.
What is it that gives it its enduring power, if it has any, and how do we then engage with it? And, classically, the answer would be something around authorship. That is, that there is a divine authorship that gives this text its weight, gives this text its authority. Mm-hmm. We may also say there's something in the values of that text, which something it expresses. Or it may be that very personal relationship that lots of people have ended up with that text. And then, my job as someone working in religion is to help that journey to be one which is done with integrity.
Well, if I may, I will move the subject along a little bit. And there was a very famous, long sort of description of God, the Old Testament God, in the God Delusion. Richard, and I'm sure you know what I'm about to mention. You described the God of the Old Testament, you said, is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Quite a mouthful. Do you still stand by that description of the God of the Old Testament that you gave?
I was accused of anti-Semitism by the recent chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs. I don't know why he thought it was anti-Semitic. It's anti-God. But I mean, that of course refers to what's been called here the terror passages, and the terror passages are taken literally by some particularly American theologians, and many people do actually believe, as I think it was Josh was recently saying, that the Bible is authored by God, and God, in those terror passages, which are not negligible in the Old Testament, they're actually quite prominent, is a horrifically unpleasant character. There's no getting away from that.
Okay. As you mentioned, the former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs said that he thought it was a profoundly anti-Semitic passage in the God Delusion. Why do you differ from him on that? He suggested that you were continuing a strain in certain anti-Semitic thinking that was essentially about saying, well, we've got a better God in the New Testament than in the Old Testament, and so on.
I don't think we've got a better God in the New Testament. I think there's something exceedingly unpleasant in the fundamental Christian doctrine of atonement, of the idea of God being unable to forgive our sins unless he tortured his son, alias himself, in the first place. And that's a revolting doctrine, actually. In some ways, it's worse than anything in the Old Testament. But that wasn't the point. When I said the God of the Old Testament, I simply meant the God of the Old Testament. What Rabbi Sachs heard was the God of the Jews, which of course is true. But that wasn't why I was singling it out. I was singling it out because the terror passages are literally horrible.
Well, it's probably not something we'll have time to address on today's programme, unfortunately, though I'm sure C.Sinkinson, our Christian guest today, would take a different view on that. We're going to a short break. So just in that last section, we had Richard defending this passage in The God Delusion where he describes the God of the Old Testament. I know both you gents, Josh and Chris, want to come back on this. And perhaps we'll start with you, Josh, sure. as a Jew. Did you sort of get where the former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs was coming from in saying that?
For what it's worth, I didn't read that as being remotely anti-Semitic. I read The God Delusion like lots of people involved in liberal religion did, because actually we're grappling with the same issues that Richard is grappling with. I was irritated by bits of it. I enjoyed bits of it. I was offended by none of it. What I was concerned about was how simplistic that line is, because what it fails to recognise is that the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, is not univocal. It has a number of different texts within it, and it has a number of different versions of how we can understand God within it, inevitably, because it's a product of different people and different times grappling with those very issues. So the vindictive God whom Richard describes is one version. I think we maybe want to argue about the use of the word vindictive. But, there is also a deeply, deeply ethical God who 3,000 years ago is saying to the Israelites, you have to care about the vulnerable in your society, you have to do your business honestly, you have to look after your workers, you have to care about the immigrant who comes into your society. So to only describe the God of the Old Testament in that way, I think, is actually just simplistic and doesn't help us to really engage with the Old Testament as a whole.
Richard, any response?
I accept that, of course. It was a passage that it was semi-tongue-in-cheek, actually, because, when I do public readings of my books, I do it with my wife, and we usually try to get a laugh from the audience early on in our performance, because it sort of lightens up the atmosphere. And that passage we always used when doing the God Delusion readings, right at the beginning, because it does get the audience roaring with laughter, and it sort of puts the audience in a friendly mood simply because they laugh. So there was a sort of, I think I went on to describe a story of Randolph Churchill, who had a similar reaction. He'd never actually read the Bible before, and he was challenged by Evelyn Waugh and a brother officer during the war to read the Bible. And he kept on exclaiming how horrified he was by God. And so it was a sort of humorous passage. And I do accept that if you look through either the Old Testament or the New Testament, you can certainly find passages of wisdom, passages that one would ethically approve of, tucked in amongst the others that one wouldn't ethically approve of. I suppose I spend a lot of time in America, and I'm very conscious that the bulk of my audience, the audience, not the bulk of them, but the audience that I'm really trying to reach, is largely an American audience. And I presume that both Chris and Josh know how many people in America actually do take the Bible literally. And you have to read the God Delusion through that filter, that I'm actually aiming it, at least partly, at those people in America who are my enemies as a scientist, who are actually subverting scientific education in a very serious way. So in a sense, I wasn't trying to irritate nice, decent liberal theologians like Chris and John.
Well, can I come in on this one, Richard? I would say straight away that I'm not offended at all. And it's certainly with my friends, with other Christians, I would want to defend to the hill your right to crack jokes. And, I'm not one for blasphemy myself, but I certainly think that we need to have the tolerance and freedom in society to allow this kind of sometimes knockabout stuff. I think that is perfectly legitimate. And so I think to start being offended by it, I think there's a kind of political correctness in our society that's very dangerous, actually, because it can prevent us from having frank and open discussion. The problem, though, I think, and Josh touched on it by talking about the simplification that's going on here, is that, Richard, you are very good with rhetoric. You have a very powerful mastery of the English language. And that rhetoric can be very bullying sometimes. And I think the way in which that passage is put, again, I'm not, don't worry, I'm not saying that I'm offended or you should take the passage out. I'm not suggesting that. But in terms of the passage, it's clearly a very slanted view of how to read the text of the Old Testament. Most of us would take the clearer passages to interpret the harder passages. We would be talking about Leviticus 19, love your neighbour as yourself, before we're looking at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, we would have an approach to Scripture that would weight things in such a way that description of God just does not sound like the God who I believe in or the God who I worship. So the rhetoric, I think, can generate a lot more heat than it does light.
That's probably fair, yes.
Okay.
Everyone's being terribly reasonable.
We are.
This is a very
very reasonable discussion. Yes, I need more fireworks, everyone, if you don't mind. Let's talk about some of these so-called terror passages, though. And they were right there on our screens on Saturday night on the first episode of the Bible. And I think we often forget the fact that there are some pretty interesting episodes. Now, you certainly bring up a couple of these in the God Delusion, Richard. Let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance. Now, that is the story in Genesis, I think it's chapter 19, in which Lot has angelic visitors, and the townspeople come and they demand that they essentially rape these visitors that he has with them. And he tells them not to do that. He essentially offers his daughters instead. But then there is sort of an intervention by God, and Lot and so on escape. Fire and brimstone rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Richard, for you, is this an example of a sort of morally repugnant story in the Old Testament?
I would only want to say something like that if there were anybody who took their morals from the Old Testament. And if you take your morals from the Old Testament, then that is a repugnant story, as are some of the other ones. But I hope you don't take your morals from the Old Testament. There are people in America who do. And those are the people that I need to call their attention to stories like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and of Lot offering.
Well, now, you say they take... I mean, I don't personally... I know quite a few evangelical Christians in America, but I don't know any that base their morality on this story, for instance.
But how do they decide which stories to base their morality on? Mm-hmm. It's all very well saying love your neighbour as yourself is good, or the Sermon on the Mount is good, Sodom and Gomorrah is horrid. But when you decide which of those stories to base your morals on, you're not using biblical methods in order to do your deciding. You're using the methods of a modern moralist, which all four of us are,
not at
in
all,
order
Richard.
to pick out the good verses from the bad.
I think C.Sinkinson wants to come in here.
Sorry, Richard. I would be using normal methods of interpretation where we look at the genre and we ask, what is the passage doing? What is a book doing? What is the context doing? And in particular, is it prescriptive or is it descriptive? Now, Leviticus 19, I think, is giving prescriptions. We still need to interpret them in terms of their time and place in the ancient Near Eastern worldview. But there are prescriptions there I need to deal with and find the principles from which I can learn. With the Sodom and Gomorrah story, it is a descriptive passage that is appalling. And to try and base any morals on the Sodom and Gomorrah story, I wouldn't even know where to begin, because I don't think it's that kind of literature. I don't think it's giving us a prescription for life. In fact, actually, Richard, if I may, I think you make a great comment on the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the behaviour of Lot, because you reflect on Lot in the God delusion. And then your summary sentence, I think, is very perceptive. You say, if this dysfunctional family was the best that Sodom had to offer by way of morals, some might begin to feel a certain sympathy with God and his judicial brimstone. Well, Rabbi Dawkins, I mean, I think I'm very happy with that gloss.
Well, okay. But I still worry about people who I know you're not one of them, but that there are people who think the Bible is literally true. There are people in America, many of them, who want to have the Ten Commandments hung up in courthouses, contrary to the Constitution. And although you can find a decent commandment among the 10, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor, etc., most of them you wouldn't actually want to base your life on. And yet there are people, I know you're not among them, but there are people who do think that we should derive our morals from the Ten Commandments, from the Old Testament.
What do you think about basing our morality on the Ten Commandments then, Josh?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that within Judaism, the Ten Commandments are just seen as 10 of, classically it's understood as being 613 commandments. Clearly, some of the issues that Richard raises also apply to those prescriptive sections, those legal sections which are interwoven into particularly the 5 books of Moses, because clearly there are legal sections which are also abhorrent to us in terms of our modern morality. But I do believe that the Torah in particular has within it some values that it expresses, some ideals within it which are hugely modern and continue to have the capacity to enrich our lives today. And also that the stories, even those terror texts, have the ability to raise the questions that are exactly our questions for today. And that's always been the Jewish approach. So, 2,000 years ago, the rabbis were asking exactly the Rabbi Dawkins questions of the text that they had inherited from the 1,000 years previously, and were exactly grappling with what do you do with Lot and condemning him. Judaism has never read the Old Testament uncritically. So they were condemning Lot. They were looking at sections, for example, around capital punishment and saying, hold on a minute, this seems arbitrary, this seems unreasonable. We have to think about how we actually process this. This can't be exactly what is meant. We shouldn't take this on face value. So, I think the authentic religious approach to the Old Testament is the one that reads it critically and which engages with it in that very critical way.
But when a modern person, or when the rabbis down the centuries that you're talking about look at the scriptures and interpret them in the light of their modern, in their own time, and we in our time, our modern morality, we do that in the light of our modern morality. Why bother with the scriptures at all? Why not just go straight to the modern morality and cut out the middleman?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's allow Chris in on this one.
Here's where my enthusiasm for the Old Testament wants to bubble over, because when we come to, you're right, we look at modern morality, we talk about the modern morality that we use, but let's also give credit to the Old Testament world and reflect on the morality in terms of the ancient Near Eastern worldview. Now, in that context, here is enlightenment. Here is an approach to the widow, the orphan, the refugee that I actually find very beautiful. I mean, I recognise the terror texts, I recognise the issues of interpretation with problematic passages, but written through it all is an approach to society which is fundamentally egalitarian. And in order to see that, we have to compare the Old Testament documents with texts from that time, such as the law codes of Hammurabi. Now, those Babylonian law codes have many parallels to the Old Testament, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but the way in which the Old Testament is very different from those legal codes from Babylonia, they highlight this egalitarian approach to life, the privilege of the poor, the importance of responsibility, that those who are in power look after those who are vulnerable. The Sabbath rest command, I find that a very beautiful command. I don't follow it. I'm not Jewish myself. I don't follow it in that sense myself. I could be broadcasting on a Saturday. But the Sabbath law I find very powerful because it describes the privilege given to the animals to take a day of rest. The land ultimately gets rest. Slaves get rest, and we want to talk about how it regulates an issue like slavery in the ancient world. Slavery common throughout the ancient world, but at least the Old Testament is regulating that kind of behaviour. So are you
saying that the Old Testament law then and morality is actually in some sense a foundational stone upon which our modern morality, that Richard says, let's go straight for that, rests in some way? Well,
I think that's true. I mean, that's a historian's judgment, and, I'm not suggesting I'm best placed to make that judgment. I think so. But I'm more saying, look, let's enjoy the power of the Old Testament and read it in its own light, read it in the context of the ancient Near East and what was going on in the ancient world. Let's not be anachronistic about it and read it in terms of a modern context where, for example, we have a well-developed prison system where we wouldn't need to depend on the death penalty in the way they did in the ancient world. But let's go back to the ancient world where they didn't have those privileges and benefits that we have today and see, well, actually, in the context of the ancient world, this is an enlightened text.
I mean, there is the challenge, though, which is a very real challenge for us as moderns engaging with religion and with those ancient texts, which is on what grounds can we and should we privilege one particular part of the text over another? And that's a very real question. Of course, it is the nature of our struggle, right? And I think what Richard speaks to, and I'm very pleased that he does, is that religion is not simple. And it shouldn't be simplistic. And those really difficult parts of the text, we have to work out how we deal with them. And it is very, it's very easy to say, there are bits of the text which are progressive for their time. And they were incredibly. Or to say that there are values underpinning some of the Old Testament texts which are modern and have real resonance for us today. And of course there are. But we're also told that we need to stone our rebellious son. And we have to engage with that text as well. Now,
I'd just be interested in your point on this, Richard. Is this just theologians picking and choosing? That's essentially what you seem to say.
No, yes, and I mean, when we say that we look at our modern morality and we are all 21st century moralists and we disapprove of slavery and we believe that women are equal and things like that. We can look back in history and look at various historical traditions and discover nuggets of that in in the Jewish tradition, in Christian tradition, in Confucianism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in all the great moral philosophers. Of course, our modern morality has its historical developments, which we ought to acknowledge and ought to study. But we shouldn't be bending over backwards to look at a particular text which happens to be ours, namely the Bible or the Old Testament, and struggle manfully to understand it in terms of modern, find the good bits and reject the bad bits and interpret the bad bits in terms. I mean, why bother? Why not just look at our modern morality and say, yes, this has historical precedents from all over the world, and it's good to look at them, but we don't have to spend all our time trying to find the bits of our particular holy text, whatever it is, whether it's the Quran or the Old Testament or whatever it might be, trying to find the bits that fit in with our modern morality. Let's keep our morality separate and think about it as moral philosophers, albeit acknowledging that it has historical roots.
And I suppose that's where we're going to really diverge, because my answer to that would be because that's the human exercise. And that's been a very powerful human exercise for thousands of years. And that particular text, because of the stuff that's within it, which is horrible, as well as the stuff that's within it, which is so precious, is a mechanism for us to ask those really deep questions. That's really what's crucial for me, is that this is a text which enriches our lives. Now, as a Jew, I'm necessarily almost in relationship with that text. But, I believe it also has the power to enrich the lives of other people because of that breadth and because of our ability to struggle with it.
Just be interested, Richard, to get your views. And again, this is an example you bring up in The God Delusion, and it was, again, part of the first episode of the Bible TV series. Very dramatic scene where Abraham takes his son Isaac up, having been commanded by God to sacrifice him. This is, of course, found in Genesis chapter 22, the story of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac, but God provides a ram caught in the thicket at the last moment. Now, you described it this way in The God Delusion. By the standards of modern morality, this disgraceful story is an example simultaneously of child abuse, bullying in two asymmetrical power relationships, and the first recorded use of the Nuremberg defence. I was only obeying orders. Yet the story is one of the greatest foundational myths of all three monotheistic religions. So you really object to this story in terms of its moral viewpoint?
Well, I trust that nobody thinks it's a morally good story. I mean, it's sometimes interpreted as being God's way of telling Abraham that you don't sacrifice humans anymore, you sacrifice a sheep instead. My feeling there, since God was, according to the story, able to talk to Abraham, why didn't he just tell him rather than put Isaac through this horrific ordeal? Clearly it isn't true. Nobody seriously thinks it's true, except at least 40% of the American population who think that everything in the Bible is literally true, and almost all of the Islamic world who think that the parallel story of Abraham nearly sacrificing Ishmael is literally true. But nobody in this studio thinks that this is literally.
Well, let's find out from C.Sinkinson, because I'm guessing you're not as liberal as Richard is assuming you are. Perhaps,
I'm not wanting to agree with Richard on this, not at all. Obviously, I'm going to also have to comment again on this word literal. I mean, I believe this is a historical event. In terms of what we mean by literature, though, this is very important, because I've been helped very much actually by the Jewish theologian Robert Alter, who has described the art of biblical narrative, that of course these historical events have been presented to us in terms of Hebrew narrative, following certain conventions. And actually, at that point, when we read the story, we discover what a beautifully crafted story it is, the way it builds up tension, the way in which there's not really a narrator's voice telling you what to do with it. There's a real sense in which it provokes a lot of questions rather than necessarily answering them easily. But that it's a historical event behind it, I'm not quite sure why you would want to dismiss that. I mean, obviously, if we didn't have the book of Genesis, we're not going to have an archaeological dig that will discover the remains of the altar. I mean, it's quite fair that there's no way of confirming this from outside of the text of Genesis. But I don't see any reason to dispute its historical reality. I don't know why it would be included if it weren't. But really, that's neither here nor there. In terms of the story itself, this is a story which I think is taken as the end of child sacrifice for the Israelite people, and yet that's surprising because in the ancient Near East, child sacrifice, human sacrifice was common. It was practiced in among the surrounding peoples, and of course Abraham had to learn who is this God he was following, what kind of God? Is it another God that wants the sacrifice of children? You say God may have just told him that, but I don't think life is as simple as that. Sometimes we need to learn lessons, and of course we can't simply lift that story out of a context that at least claims to be nearly 4,000 years ago and suggest it could happen today. Not for one moment would I want to condone anybody who suggests that God would tell them to do an evil, wicked thing today. But in its context, when these things were not known, God was progressively revealing his character. And this next stage in the Genesis account is to understand that this God that Abraham worshipped is not the kind of God who would request or require the sacrifice of a child.
Be interested in your response to that, Richard. Obviously, Chris painting that this is actually, rather than being a horrific story, rather a good picture of the
words
God.
Fail me. I mean, there you have the theological mind in all its glory.
Well, thank you.
I take it that's not a compliment on your part, Richard.
It's not a compliment. I'm actually rather shocked that you even consider the possibility that it happened. I thought that what progressive theologians did was to say that these things are symbolic. They're moral stories, a bit like Aesop's fables.
Okay, but why would you say that one is symbolic? And not, say, a later story regarding King Hezekiah?
You just said that it's neither here nor there whether it happened. You said what really matters.
Well, for our conversation,
it's a powerful story which drove home the moral that, unlike the surrounding peoples of Canaan, the Jews should stop sacrificing children, and so it's a moral tale like an Aesop's fable. Nobody actually thinks that Aesop's
can it not be both and?
Well, that would be my point. Can it not be both and? I mean, I've no question that there's a moral to the story, but that the story can be true as well in other senses with a historical kernel to it. That I can't see why we have to choose.
You mean you think God actually told Abraham to sacrifice his son and then reprieved him at the last
It's described very briefly in the Genesis account, so I can't tell you all the details about how that may have happened, but it's based on a historical event. I mean, can't you agree that there's no reason why it couldn't be based on a historical event? Of course, if you don't believe in God, you're not going to believe that God spoke to Abraham.
It may be based on a historical event, in which case it's shocking.
Okay, but at least we're just agreeing that to say that we can treat it as a tale with a moral doesn't mean it can't be based in real history.
No, but I mean, I was charitably giving you the benefit of the doubt.
I don't want that charity.
Once again, I think we're sort of being driven off the really important question here. So, as I say, I'm largely indifferent to questions of historicity. What we do have here is a narrative which is incredibly rich. So Chris has referred to the literary nature of the work, and we know that many of the biblical narratives are extraordinarily crafted narratives, using wordplay and playing with time and leaving questions open, and this is a really fabulous piece of literature, particularly in the original. But it's also rich morally as well. So I think, where I would disagree with either of you is to say there is a moral to this story. There are multiple morals to this story. The Old Testament, certainly the Torah, is not there to tell us what we're supposed to think in these sorts of places. It's there to raise a whole bunch of questions for us that we then have to grapple with if we're going to live well in the world. Now, there are other ways of asking those questions, but the Old Testament's a really good one.
Well, we're going to have to go to a quick break. Well, just as we wrap up today's conversation, thanks again to Professor Richard Dawkins, C.Sinkinson and Rabbi Josh Levy, who have been with me on the programme today. Richard, the Old Testament then, you can recognise obviously that there is some value to some of the, the language and the storytelling, in particular as you've appreciated it in the King James Version. But as far as it applying to today, do you believe that there is simply a disconnect? We need to leave this behind. Why can't we just be moral without reference to these ancient stories?
Yes, I certainly think that. I agree with my colleagues that it's very rich. It's fable, it's myth. It shares that with the Greek myths, with myths from all over the world. Many of them do have moral meaning for the cultures in which they grew up, I repeat the point that it's entirely arbitrary that we happen to be talking about the Hebrew myth because that's what all four of us are brought up in. We could do exactly the same thing with the Greek myths, with the Indian myths, and you would not wish to live your life according to the behavior of Zeus and Apollo or the Norse gods or anything like that. These are all powerful, rich stories, and we can take them in all sorts of different ways. There is nothing special about the Bible just because we happen to have been brought up in its tradition.
Josh, as we start to conclude today's programme, how would you apply the Old Testament for today?
Well, I think the question Richard asks, which is, why should we privilege this text? I would want to say there are things about it which are exceptional. I think it is exceptionally rich. And there is something exceptional about the fact that it has continued to have resonance and be a way for people to think about the world for thousands of years. We're talking about a text which is in places 3,000 years old, which continues to have us arguing about it for an hour on the radio. And tenacity in and of itself is not an argument for keeping something, but it suggests there is something exceptional about the text. But what's important for me is that Judaism has never read that text uncritically. Whatever its perspective on authorship and origin, that has never stopped Jews from looking at the text and saying, oh gosh, that looks a bit weird, or I really have to think about how to deal with that, or, is that character behaving morally or not? Or in the places which are legal texts, how do I want to apply that because there's something that feels strange, difficult there, or something which feels wonderful and fabulous and enriching there? So this is a text which has the ability to enrich our lives, but only if we don't approach it simplistically, either to simplistically reject it or to read it simplistically and take it simplistically in the way that I know that Richard particularly objects to.
Chris, finally.
I think I've got to be honest and say there are two types of answer I'd want to give. One type, obviously, from my faith perspective, I believe in Jesus Christ, and therefore through him I have a particular faith response to the Old Testament as the Word of God. And that is my understanding of the Old Testament and why I have a personal vested interest in it. But that's separate, I think, from a more general cultural issue here, which is that I think in an age of growing illiteracy and a sense of not being conscious of our history and our culture and our background, I think it's imperative that we can encourage people to read the Old Testament, to understand these foundation documents. If the Inca myths and legends, if we're going to use those words so lightly, if the Inca myths and legends were the foundation documents for our society, we would be living in a very different society today. The Old Testament is the earliest documents to provide humane descriptions of how warfare should be fought. So for all of the terror texts that we might debate and discuss, within the legal code, there are some very humane teachings on war and on how society should be organised and on the treatment of the poor and the vulnerable, leading to modern-day issues like the Stop Human Trafficking campaign that friends of mine are involved in, or the Jubilee campaign regarding debt and other nations. So I think in being conscious of our history, our background, and what Richard has described as great literature, I think we actually only enrich our understanding of these issues we're facing today. And boy, do we need to understand these issues if we're going to be a literate and historically conscious